Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Halifax International Security Forum in Nova Scotia, Canada, one of the world's leading gatherings of military, civilian, economic, political, and cultural thought leaders from around the world. And one of them is Andrew Tabler, who is with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy in Washington, D.C., an august think tank. And you're one of the world's leading experts on the Syria crisis, which you and I have been talking about, and you've been talking about now with some passion for many years. Bring us up to speed. Where are we on this crisis now that ISIS has been defeated? So that's on the upside in parts of Iraq. But still enormous challenges. Walk us through where we are on this and what's the next step.
Sure. So the good news is that ISIS is losing territory, is being militarily defeated, and that's a long-term goal of the United States, and that's a great thing, given what ISIS has done to Americans, to people in the region, and so on. The bad news is the forces that are retaking territory from ISIS on the pro-regime side are overwhelmingly supplied by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. So this is a long-term trend in Syria, but recently it's spiked. And this is the reason why National Security Council advisor H.R. McMaster said recently that 80% of forces now fighting against Daesh in eastern Syria are funded by the IRGC. So that's bad news because the way the war is shaking out, for some parties that's acceptable, but for neighboring countries, and particularly Israel, it's unacceptable. And so the question is the way the Syrian war ending going to set off another conflict, and if so, how?
And what does last year when we spoke, you gave some advice to the Trump team, insofar as they were listening in terms of formulating their own plans. What's the advice you would give the administration and the international community, as somebody who understands all the nuances associated with this, on what the international community's next steps here have to be?
So the diplomatic process that currently, and most recently, President Trump and President Putin agreed to in Da Nang, Vietnam, on November 11th is a good step forward in that trying to get the Geneva talks going again, talking about de-confliction inside of areas where Russian and U.S. forces fight, and de-escalation, meaning essentially on the road to a ceasefire in southwest Syria. All these things are good in and of themselves. The problem is that what creates the necessity for that actually all these things to occur. The Russians feel very differently about the outcome of the Syrian war. They would like Bashar al-Assad to remain. They say that he's not vital to their operations, but he is. And they're in alliance with the Iranians inside of Syria. So getting them out of those areas, getting them out of that policy is going to take a lot of American effort, not only inside of Syria with different groups there, but also with those allies in the region, such as Saudi Arabia and Israel and so on.
It's a two-part question. First, everybody's perception at the time many people's perception at the time Russia became involved was that it was a mistake. Whereas, why is it's actually been an enormous success, hasn't it, from a Russian perspective?
It's been a pretty low-cost, light footprint policy. They've killed a lot of people. But they have legal trappings of the Assad regime to exist under, and they've been able to maintain. If it wouldn't have been for the Russian and Iranian interventions in Syria, Bashar al-Assad would control very, very little amount of territory, and the regime would have severely contracted. So in that sense, it is a victory. Now, how can they win the peace? And that once you start getting into reconstruction, I don't think they want to pay for that. And of course, they don't have much money to do that. The Iranians don't either. So they're looking, I think, to the international community in the West in particular to get involved in that. And that's where I think the next set of decisions are going to be. If we're going to get involved in stabilizing and reconstructing Syria, where's a good place to start? And I think the early answer from the Trump administration, and I think it's the right one, is that we're not going to pay a dime to reconstruct Syria and Assad regime in Iranian-controlled areas.
And what does Syria look like, and how do they actually stabilize the country enough for the Syrian diaspora, which is stressing stressing Turkey, stressing Jordan, stressing Lebanon, I mean, stressing basically everybody in the region, including Europe, where a lot of the anti-immigration sentiment is in part fueled by that. And then, of course, opponents to immigration also use Syrians as a punching bag in the United States. What's it going to take for, what does the state look like, and what's it going to take to sort of put it back together again enough for Syrians to want to return home?
So I think it's going to be a bit of back to the future. It's going to be like Iraq in the 90s, where you had a minority-dominated government with the legal trappings of the state in the capital. You had a northern Kurdish region and a region in the southern part of the country, in the case of Iraq, where you had the majority Shia population. In Syria, it's the Assad regime in the center, the Kurdish area in the north, and in the south, in particular the southwest, you have the majority Sunni population in the country. The major difference between those two scenarios, however, this is where history, it doesn't repeat itself; it only rhymes.
Right.
Is that the Assad regime is far weaker militarily than Saddam's ever was. During the 90s, Saddam could often lash out into these other areas. Bashar al-Assad regime can do that, but not without a lot of foreign involvement. And that foreign involvement, this is the second difference, is direct Iranian involvement. Shia militia from Afghanistan, Iraq, and Lebanese Hezbollah, which also funded by the IRGC, and they're training up whole units and core of the Syrian military. So that's a major difference, and that's the reason why countries like Israel are so concerned and have been threatening more recently more strikes and war against Iran and its allies in Syria and Lebanon.
How does this Iranian crisis, though, play out in Syria, and what's next? Because the Saudi Arabia, in an extraordinary maneuver last week, you were in Paris, we were in Dubai watching this play out, where he was summoned to Riyadh, he resigned, he was held at the Ritz-Carlton, he then ended up in France subsequently. Lebanon still doesn't have a leader, but largely this was driven by the fact that Saudi Arabia had given billions of dollars in aid to Lebanon and had certain expectations, and those expectations were not fulfilled. And then you have Sheikh Nasrallah get involved in this and declare war against Saudi Arabia. How does this all play out over the next, say, year? And what is the strategy the international community needs to actually stabilize this, because it's all an interrelated chess game? So
the Hariri issue and being forced to resign, which it's unclear exactly the circumstances. It's not, I think he's now going to return to Lebanon on Wednesday.
Okay.
We'll have to see what happens when he returns. Is, I think, primarily driven by two things. One is the Hariri family is involved in business dealings with some of those who are on the outs with the current the new order in Saudi Arabia, so to speak.
Right.
But I think most importantly, they were tired of supporting the prime minister, who they felt was letting Hezbollah run roughshod over the Lebanese state.
Right.
And so I think this was a way to curtail that. It was a pretty brazen way to do it. I'm not sure it was particularly well thought out or worked out. We'll have to see. But the space between the Lebanese state and Hezbollah has dramatically narrowed. And that is in keeping with the fact that Hezbollah is now playing a major role as essentially its own legion. It's like not a foreign legion, but a Lebanese legion. And the organization has about tripled or so in size since beginning to fight in Syria.
So where are we going to be in a year's time?
We'll have to watch to see what the Israelis do now. Do they, what does it mean that they can't find the current way the Syrian war is shaking out unacceptable? Or how can they deal with that? Are they going to strike militarily? Is Hezbollah going to strike back? That would certainly destroy Lebanon and shut down Israel for a good amount of time, so it's costly. Beyond that, I think we're going to be looking at some kind of diplomatic process, and we're going to have two of them. One is in Geneva, with the goal of a united Syrian state, and one that has negotiations at its basis. There's another process in Astana, Kazakhstan, between the Russians, the Turks, and the Iranians, and that process is more one that is essentially dressing up military victory as a diplomatic victory. The one thing that, and it was pretty clear here in the discussions here today with the Turkish chief of staff, is they're exacerbating U.S. tensions between Turkey and the U.S. over Washington's support for the YPG Kurds in in Syria, who the Turks regard as their archenemy.
But the organization that did the most to fight ISIS, aside from the Iranians.
That's right. I mean, but exactly, they've done a tremendous amount to fight against ISIS, and they put their necks on the line. But they're also the ones that we primarily organized and funded. So you can do a lot with American weapons. The United States is very good at fighting these kind of wars, and they have a lot of experience in it. But I think the thing the Kurds had going for them is they had a political unity of purpose. The problem is that unity of purpose in a peacetime environment the Turks don't like, and they find it unacceptable. So we'll have to wait and see how that shakes out.
You do have quite a lot of job security, Andrew, sadly.
Maybe we'll have to wait and see. It's very depressing, but you have to keep going and try and find. And even after this, this war draws to a close, or at least in part of the country, there could be others, and those other wars can reshape the people of the region. Half of the Syrian population is outside their homes, and it gets to your earlier question. The problem we're going to have is what we're building in Syria going to be anything that people want to return home to? And if not, are they permanently going to be with us? And that's a big question.
And in about 15 seconds, ISIS, does it come back, or has it been pushed out of the country?
No, it'll come back. We already know that, but it will come back in maybe an insurgency, and this is the reason why the U.S. should not, and I don't think they're going to, cut and run in places like Syria and Iraq. We have to maintain a presence so that we can keep those groups from coming back. Because look what happened last time. We left Iraq in 2011. Only a few years later, ISIS had taken over huge swaths of Iraqi territory and over half of Syrian territory. We need to make sure that doesn't happen again.
Andrew, thanks very much again.
My pleasure.